Well, before Fetterman left, his orders from Colonel Carrington were very specific and very clear. And I'm going to read the orders. I don't know if you really have to write them down. You can paraphrase them in your own words. But his were the exact orders that Fetterman was given by Carrington. He said, relieve the wood train from Indian attack, but do not pursue the enemy beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. And he repeated that no less than 3 times to Fetterman before he left. Again, relieve the wood train from Indian attack, but do not pursue the enemy beyond Lodge Trail Ridge, because he knew what might happen if they did. Well, Fetterman, as I mentioned, was a little bit arrogant. He once stated to someone, give me 80 men and I will ride through the entire Sioux Nation. That was his goal. That was his command. Give me 80 men. Matter of fact, I got it up here somewhere. I have to find it. Look at this book right here. This made such an impact. What's the name of this book? Give me 80 men. This is a book talking about what we're going to talk about. We're going to give you about a 10-minute lecture. There's a lot to this. Okay? So he was a fairly arrogant man. He always made the comment, give me 80 men and I'll run through the entire, I'll ride through the entire Sioux Nation. Now, why would you think you could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with 80 men? He didn't believe that the weapons that the army had were so much more superior than what the Indians had that it would make the difference. We'll see if he's right. So, at 11:15 a.m. on December what? 21st, 1866, Captain Fetterman and his men depart from Fort Phil Kearny. 11:15.
So it's the 21st, not the 22nd?
Well, this will be 21st and 20. This will be 2-day affair, so to speak. Okay? So they depart at 11:15 a.m. Now, obviously, kind of like the Custer battlefield, this full story of what really happened from this point on from the white perspective will never be known. But I'm giving you the historical conclusion according to what people researched and studied. Okay? So, they leave the fort at 11:15. They relieve the wood train, like they're supposed to, and they ride to the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge, right at the top, where they haven't violated any orders at this point. And it's 11:45 when they do that. So it takes them about 30 minutes from the time that they leave the fort to the time that they have relieved the wood train and they're now at the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge. Well, as Fetterman and his men are looking into that valley I talked about, they see Sioux Chief Crazy Horse and 7 warriors at a distance. That's all they see in the valley, is Sioux Chief Crazy Horse and 7 warriors. They have 83 men, right? 81. 7 warriors and Crazy Horse, yep. And those 8 Indians are kind of serving as decoys, and they're baiting Fetterman, trying to push him to come over Lodge Trail Ridge. And I'll give you some examples of how they are trying to bait Fetterman over the ridge. Pretty elementary, a lot of them. First of all, they're swearing at the soldiers. So they're just swearing and swearing and swearing at these soldiers. Well, no, but they know what they have Indian scouts, they know what's happening. They also gave the soldiers various hand gestures. They do the white hand gesture of non-positive appearance. What is that? Oh, give them a little this. Oh, yeah, okay. I mean, they had the idea, right? They also turned and mooned the soldiers. That might tell you the truth. They turned and mooned the soldiers. Nobody ever misses that one on the test, just so you know. Nobody ever misses that one. So they even turned and mooned the soldiers. And according to the Indian account, Crazy Horse even built a fire just out of the range of what he thought the soldiers' rifles would shoot, and built a fire and sat there and warmed his hands.
What would the Indians wearing? It's December, it'd be freezing over there.
Well,
They just built a fire.
Yeah. Now, William Fetterman, Captain Fetterman, was a little bit arrogant, and this really aggravated him. And finally, he could take no more, and he thought he would go over Lodge Trail Ridge and show those 8 Native Americans who was boss. Okay? So an aggravated Captain William Fetterman can take no more. He advances towards the 8 decoys over Lodge Trail Ridge. And he can see him, and he and his men are pushing these decoys into the valley, farther into the valley, and pretty soon they find themselves right in the bottom of this valley, surrounded by these bluffs and ridges. Once that infantry and cavalry and those officers and civilians got into that deep valley, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors were waiting in ambush along the ridges. When you get there, you could see that you could easily kind of hide below each ridge. It's kind of a rolling bunch of ridges, and they're all in there waiting. Now I'll try to, you guys all have this information here and what you have to do, right? I'll talk to Zoe about that in a minute, or remind you again of the period. Well, basically what you have here is you have a great big valley, okay? Just have a great big valley here is what you have. And here was Lodge Trail Ridge, and these are all ravines and places that would be easily accessible to hide yourself behind and not be seen. So these decoys are over here. They're baiting these soldiers, and here comes Fetterman, and he gets himself in the middle of the valley. Okay? He gets him. You want to get a drink here? You can. You got one? Well, when the fighting began, Fetterman's command became sitting ducks, and they retreated back up the valley floor to the high ground. So they turn and come back towards Lodge Trail Ridge. Well, the infantry was in this area. This is the infantry, this is the cavalry, and here's poor old Wheatley and Fisher at the far end of the valley, the farthest away from the high ground. So they start their retreat. Okay, they're in this area. The infantry with Fetterman starts their retreat. The cavalry is going to hold the ground here a little bit while they retreat, and their plan is to retreat, and here's poor Wheatley and Fisher right up at the end of the valley. So, after the serious fighting began, Captain Fetterman's command became sitting ducks. They retreated back up the valley to the high ground. The infantry that were the first to fall back, as I mentioned, towards Lodge Trail Ridge. They were under constant Indian assault from both ridges. Mainly bows and arrows were used in this particular fight. Along with Wheatley and Fisher, by the way, in this area here, were 3 other enlisted soldiers. So there were 5 people at the very end.
Did the 2 civilians, were they armed?
Oh yeah, and I'll tell you how they knew where they fell. Okay, that's a good question. Now, those 5 men were hit first because they're in the front of the battle. And they fought desperately against the Indian warriors, but they were soon overrun and killed. And how did they identify this is where Wheatley and Fisher were? How'd they later identify that? There was no one survived this to say. Because they were the only ones using Henry rifles. And what did they find in that area? Tons of cartridges. Tons that they just fight. And so you can tell that they fought for a pretty long period of time because there wasn't 3 or 4 cartridges there. There were lots of Henry's cartridges there. So they knew that's where Fisher and Wheatley fell. and alongside them were the 3 other infantrymen. They found over 60 blood spots later when the military went in there, and what they considered piles of Henry rifle cartridges that were found in which those fellows were killed. According to rumor, both Wheatley and Fisher had over 100 arrows each embedded into their bodies. That was a little bit of overkill, but that's what they did. So Wheatley and Fisher were later identified because they had been using Henry repeating rifles and were the only men with that weapon in the fight. Over 60 blood spots and piles of Henry rifle cartridges were found where Wheatley and Fisher were killed. In addition, it was rumored that both Fisher and Wheatley had over 100 arrows embedded in their bodies when they were found. Well, what's the next group that's hit? If they're retreating back up? Cavalry. So the next group hit by the Indian warriors were Lieutenant George W. Grummond and the cavalry. Now, if you go there, which we will, you'll see kind of a lone tree right here. And what the cavalry did is they formed a defense line at that lone tree and really tried hard to defend themselves, but they were soon overrun. Grummond and 2 other soldiers were found farther down, closer to Lodge Trail Ridge, where they must have broken away and tried to get out of there. So Grummond and 2 other cavalrymen were found back up the valley floor, kind of a short distance from where the defense line was set up by the tree. So they had obviously tried to get out of there but didn't make it. So what's the last group to be killed? Fetterman and the infantry. Okay? And Fetterman and the remaining infantrymen were surrounded and killed closer to Lodge Trail Ridge, about a half mile from where the cavalry fell. So from here to where Fetterman fell was about a half mile. Okay? That was kind of interesting because the only Indians who were killed by friendly fire, because they were on these ridges and they're lobbing arrows into these guys and they're hitting each other at times. That's the only casualties they faced, was when they accidentally shot themselves firing across the valley. When you see it, you'll understand really a lot more what it was about.
So Wheatley and Fisher didn't kill anybody? They were just popping off shells like a madman?
I don't think, there's no accounts of them killing anybody. We'll talk about that in a minute. Well, what time did that whole thing start? About 11:45. Well, at 12 noon, soldiers at the gate of Fort Phil Kearny that were guarding the gate could hear this firing beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. So from 11:45 to 12, that 15 minutes is when they kind of got themselves down there and got positioned, and the Indians made their attack. About 12 noon is when it was recorded they started hearing the firing. Now at first they heard kind of sporadic firing, which is what? Bang, 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 at different times. And then the last things they heard were 2 loud blasts, kind of like cannon blasts. But they knew they weren't cannons because they didn't take any cannons. What were those 2 loud blasts? Anybody want to guess? No? No, not you get 2.
Did they all wait, and then when they were coming, they all shot at once?
2 volleys, very good. They were 2 solid volleys in which they were commanded to hold their fire and fire at the same time, hoping to get success out of that, which, again, it's hard to tell the Indian casualties because of the reports. So there were no cannons in the fight. It was later discovered that the 2 loud blasts were 2 separate volley fires from the infantry in an attempt to slow the charging Indian warriors. 81 against maybe 2,000. Can you imagine that? Well, other than a shot here or there heard, The second volley shot was the last firing of the battle as the day kind of went silent. Well, Colonel Carrington was notified of the firing, and so he ordered Captain Tenador Tenike and 76 men to move out to Fetterman's relief, to try to provide him relief, not knowing that there wasn't anybody to relieve. Does that make sense?
How many men?
76. So after being notified of the firing, Colonel Carrington ordered Captain Tenador Tenike and 76 men to move out to Fetterman's relief. And he reaches, with those 76 men, the summit of Lodge Trail Ridge at 12:45 p.m. So after being ordered out of the fort, Captain Tenador Tenike and 76 men reach the crest or summit of Lodge Trail Ridge at 12:45. What do they see when they go over the ridge?
Bodies.
They see thousands of Indians celebrating with scattered shooting of military rifles. They're celebrating like they won the Super Bowl, so to speak. They're down there celebrating. That's all they see is thousands of Indians celebrating. And the Indians began to gather their arrows from the fight. And they shout at Captain Tenike and his men, inviting them, come on over and get killed. Trying to get them to come over the ridge as well. And for several minutes, Captain Tenike scanned the valley floor and saw no sign of Fetterman's men. None. Could see none of his men. So he sets up there. He's not foolish enough to go over the ridge. And he basically scans the valley and he doesn't see one soul of Fetterman's command. Anybody want to know why? What's that? They did kind of hide the bodies. You know where they hid the bodies? Underneath them. Because when the Indians finally withdrew, there were so many Indians in the valley, when they withdrew out, Tenike could see the bodies laying on the ground. There were so many Indians in that valley, they couldn't see the dead bodies laying on the ground. And when they withdrew from the valley, Captain Tenike and his command could see dead soldiers everywhere on the valley floor. So according to historians, the battle lasted less than 45 minutes and no survivors from Captain Fetterman's command. 45-minute battle, no survivors. So if you're Captain Tenike, what do you do at this point? You make darn sure that all the Indians are what? Gone, because you don't want to get down in there and find out you got problems. When he believes that they are gone, he cautiously advances towards the battlefield and he witnesses dead men laying naked and mutilated, blood frozen in their wounds. It is December 21st.
Is there snow under there?
Yeah, there sure is. Merry Christmas is right. So these guys were naked, mutilated. They took their uniforms, boots, equipment, and everything, left them there naked and mutilated. Blood was frozen in their wounds. That's how cold it was. When the rescue party went down there, they witnessed a really interesting thing. They looked at the rocks that surrounded the valley. You know what they found on those rocks? Eyeballs. Indians had taken the eyeballs out of the soldiers and set them on the rocks. Why would they do that? So they would go in the next time they fought them without sight. Okay, so they were mutilated. Cut out the soldiers' eyeballs and placed them on the rocks. Kind of interesting what they found. Lieutenant Grumman's cavalry were kind of spread out over the skirmish line. So they had made a skirmish line here at the tree, so their bodies were kind of fallen in a line. Whereas Fetterman's infantry all lay in a circle about 40 feet in diameter. Because what did they do? They packed in to try to defend themselves, and they were all basically killed in a 40-foot circle.
Did they take their horses?
And he took everything. Yeah, anything they could take. So the cavalry horses, I'm certain, were taken. Now, this is kind of interesting because historians, we don't know this for sure, but trying to do the research, they estimated that probably 40,000 arrows were shot in this battle. 40,000. Now, if each, that might be an overestimate, because if each warrior, 2,000 warriors had 10 arrows or 100 arrows like we talked about, how much would that be?
20,000.
Okay, so that may be a little stretch, but who knows? Possibly 40,000 arrows were shot in the 45-minute battle, which would average about 1,000 a minute. You can imagine that. Can you imagine that? Going to be in that valley and having arrows raining down on you. They weren't aiming at anyone specifically. They were just out there, just firing as many as they could. Now, there were reports of approximately 38 guns used by the Indians in the Fetterman battle. How would they know that? Cartridges. Very good. Because the Fetterman command had specific rifles and pistols. So any cartridge that didn't match other than the Henrys that were used by Fisher and Wheatley were identified as guns that were used by the Indians. Probably 38 different guns is what they stated. The only defeat of the U.S. Army on the Western Plains is upcoming in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This is the only battle that will be worse. Well, Captain Tenike and his soldiers began to load the dead into ammunition wagons, and they headed back to the fort without retrieving them all. Why?
Some were so badly mutilated.
Guess? Getting what?
They wanted to get out of there.
Yeah, because it was getting dark, and they didn't want to be the victim of their own attack. So they very cautiously picked up as many bodies as they could and put them in ammunition wagons and headed back to the fort without retrieving them all because it was dark. Well, that evening, which was a very dark and cold evening, Colonel Carrington sent for a soldier at Fort Phil Kearny by the name of John Portugee Phillips.